Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our business-focused webinar, How 2020 Changed VDI. My name is Chris Monagle. I am the host of this webinar, and I am Aspire's Marketing Content Specialist. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time, and we have a great session for you. Before we start, I'll quickly mention that everyone is muted during the webinar. Please submit your questions via the Q&A box that's located on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We are recording today's webinar. A replay will be available to view on our website, www.aspiretransforms.com, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email. Our speakers today are Christian Chavez and Chuck Foley. Christian is a data center and cloud solutions architect at Aspire. He has over 15 years of consulting and implementation experience in various architectures. And Chuck Foley is a senior director at NetApp. He is a seasoned high-tech executive with a strong background in enterprise computing, storage, networking, and software. And without further ado, I will turn things over to you, Christian.
All right, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. Chuck, welcome. It's a pleasure to speak and work with you again.
Thank you so much.
It's always awesome to do that. Interesting enough, 2020, as I'm just going to say it, right, has been a game changer for a lot of things that happened in the industry. And what we're focused on today is virtual desktops. And so if we roll back to virtual desktops and how they were, let's say back 2008, right? We were doing rollouts and working with clients and helping build that momentum. And it started looking like, hey, this is the year of the virtual desktop. This is the year of the virtual desktop. A lot of things were being figured out yet. Companies were trying to be mobile, but it never happened, right? And it wasn't until probably 2018-ish, right? We were starting to get it right. We were learning from things that were happening, prior to that, trying to get desktops rolled out, but there was a lot of things that were impeding some of that. And what happened was VDI was rolling out slowly. And what I mean by slow is companies were taking this project on and doing it in sort of like little pods. And a lot of things needed to be taken into consideration when we were doing virtual desktops. The biggest one is the end user, right? So the end user experience had to be that of what they were experiencing today on traditional laptops, as well as infrastructure. That was also something that was needed to be considered as well. And the infrastructure just wasn't there. So companies were very cautious when it came to rolling out desktops. And it was sort of, we want to get there, but there was a lot of things that were happening that we just weren't fully on board to get to that. I talked about there was a lot of moving parts that had to be there as well, which was the underlying infrastructure. You had to consider storage, network, your IT teams, right? Because one of the things that you needed to do was also support the desktop. So it really wasn't just about rolling the desktop. The underlying pieces that had to come together and ultimately was to impact the user experience, right? So if your users can't work, then there's no benefit to it. And you also had to realize the investment that had to happen at the virtual desktop as well, with all these underlying things that had to happen. So that really is what kind of slowed things down and really taught it as either a pet project, but larger enterprise businesses were kind of going full in. They were building things around it and doing the investments. But the mid-tier, they were kind of holding back yet, and it wasn't until a lot of things needed to happen. 2020 came along and kind of propelled those that were sort of holding back and being cautious to, this is no longer a cautionary tale, right? This is a thing that has to happen because of what happened in 2020. So going back over the years, as we learned and adopted, we still had to pivot in a moment's notice as to what happened last year. There was something pivotal, and Chuck, you and I were talking about this the other day, something pivotal in 2019 that actually helped increase the momentum that was happening from Microsoft. If you could
Yep.
just give us, tell us what happened at Microsoft that actually changed some of that for us.
Well, as you noted, VDI has had some of its challenges. Some were technology based, some were user adoption based, but some were commercial based. And for the longest time, VDI, being a great idea, still carried a price. And in 2019, Microsoft said, we're going to change the rules of the game, because they wanted to really incent moving this workload up to the cloud. So they did two things. They did one thing that had two key pieces from the commercial aspect. They introduced Microsoft WVD, or Windows Virtual Desktop. That's capital V, capital D, as opposed to small v, small d, right? So it's a branded, it's a thing, it's a
Right.
technology and a licensing scheme. So Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop is an Azure-based virtual desktop environment. Key point, Azure-based, cloud-based. You only get to take advantage of this in the cloud. Second, what they did is they said, let's remove some of the barriers to entry from a commercial perspective. And so they started using Windows 10 multi-user capability instead of Windows Server as the OS. Right away, that means customers are not burdened with paying that Windows Server license. Now, the way that's reflected in the cloud is the VMs that you're using are less expensive. If you chose a given VM, like a DS2 v3 with a certain amount of CPU and memory and disk, etc., it might cost X for a Windows machine, but Y for it's essentially the Linux pricing. It's a non-Windows burdened machine. That's one that took a big chunk of the cost out. Second thing is, if you're doing WVD and Azure, you're not having to pay client access licenses, the CALs. That could be $5 or $6 a month per user. You got 1,000 users, and that's $5-6 grand a year. That kind of money adds up. So by taking these pieces out of the equation, the Windows Server OS cost and the CAL, this is provided you have an O3 or now Microsoft 365 enterprise license, which most businesses do. You get to take advantage of that, and that really helped a lot of people say, this is looking pretty darn cost effective. Let's take a look at this.
Yeah, so you had mentioned Azure, right? I think a lot of that adoption was getting, obviously, cloud strategy has been huge. Virtual desktops actually started pushing the limits of some of that, because although licensing back then, right, was per desktop, per laptop, what you were giving out to your users.
Yep.
We've now, gotten into the world of virtualization. We've sort of compressed all the resources that were necessary, and we've increased the footprint in terms of desktops, virtual machines. So licensing at that point, right? So you had a smaller footprint in the data center, but large deployments of virtual machines and or looking to do desktops, right? So yeah, that posed a licensing problem, because you can do a lot more with less. So taking that pivot, I think, was crucial, and again, that was one of the components that was sort of the burden of rolling out desktops, including I mentioned the infrastructure. A lot of that needed to happen, which I think we've realized with virtualization, help us get there. So definitely the cloud strategy is something that was key for businesses moving. And the other thing too is when we were doing rollouts, right? We were doing some of these proof of concepts. Companies were taking the role of, let's start with the users that don't do much or do, very smaller tasks, right? So the tasks of each of these users was the minimal tasks. So the user experience might have been realized a lot faster. But then you have the power users, right? We're talking people who are using 3D, who are doing CAD. Those types of remote users, we needed to now not only, so the underlying infrastructure that we were building for those, light task user was now needed or necessary, right? So now we're talking GPUs, and we're talking a lot of this infrastructure that's being added. And again, it really comes back to how do you manage that, right? How did that impact your IT teams who were more focused on doing desktop, more focused on doing laptop? Now they're doing virtualization. A lot of these things changed. And it also impacts the IT teams or management, right? So the management of all this needs to happen. What have you seen in terms of like data management or maybe desktop management that has to happen inside the IT teams?
Well, first of all, I want to key on something you said here, which is the shift of the profile of people using VDI. And the way I characterize it is that what you noted from the past few years, it had traditionally, not always, but traditionally been a lower trust model, lower resource usage. So I kind of categorize it as low trust, low resource, not to demean anybody. But what that means is low trust, meaning contractors, temp employees, maybe high turnover shift workers like in call centers and that kind of thing. Those are the kind of people that you saw using VDI. And by nature of their workload, they usually used lower resources. They weren't using things like design programs and CAD CAM, or they weren't the executives that needed immediate response to their queries. They were more moderate in terms of their resource profile. So we've shifted from a low trust, low resource to maybe a high trust, low resource, which is, no, these are our employees. They're not contractors. They're not alternative workforce, but they don't need all that much horsepower, so VDI fits for them. To now, we're seeing a lot, at post 2020, a lot of movement to high trust, high resource.
Right.
We're talking really expensive people that need, as you mentioned, CPUs, CAD CAM capabilities, data query, AI, higher level executives that have kind of gotten over that hump and said, I don't need a full blown desktop anymore. I just need access freely to a VDI session from anywhere, as long as it can perform. And that brings in kind of what you said is, what have we seen from the data management shift? I will tell you this, we have seen a shift of, I hate to use the word, but it's a responsibility or liability shift. And what I mean by that is, when you have 5,000 employees and everybody's got their own laptop or notebook or desktop or whatever, and some employee in London didn't back up and loses his data.
Right.
Everyone says, what a fool. Why didn't he do that? Or when someone in Chicago lets ransomware onto his machine and it locks up his machine, you say, dude, you should have known better than to click that link. The responsibility and the liability is at the end user level. Guess what happens when you move 5,000 people into a centralized data center or a cloud center perspective, and you're providing end user compute for there? Now, if somebody loses data, it's the guys managing the system that are said, why wasn't that data protected? Or if ransomware gets in, they're like, why didn't you protect for that? The blame shifts from the end user to the IT team, which can be scary, but it doesn't need to be, because there's lots of services out there. But it's one of the things that if you're deploying VDI at enterprise scale, you need to make sure you say, yes, I've done this. Yes, I've made sure that not only are my users, not only the machine images and my own shared files, but think about it. If you got 5,000 users, most of them are using something like Microsoft Office 365 or now Microsoft 365. Are you backing that up? Yeah. Over half of the enterprises surveyed by ESG said, I didn't know it was my responsibility. Now, don't get me wrong. Microsoft has a highly resilient infrastructure. I'm not concerned about me and my employees not being able to get at our O365 stuff. Or if there's an outage, it'll fail over to another data center. They're highly resilient. But the data that's in that data center, Microsoft has clearly said in the agreement, that's mine. So if I have an employee that lets ransomware into his OneDrive, if I have I don't know if you saw the article last week, it just came out. There was a contractor that was fired by a West Coast based company. He was disgruntled. So after the fact, he still knew how to access some of their systems, and he deleted all of their O365 accounts.
Oh, I saw that.
The whole business was down for 3 days. It took 3 months for them to rebuild. And Microsoft said, I'm sorry, but you should have had that stuff protected. There are some easy, like here at NetApp, we have something called NetApp SaaS Backup, which says, here's my O365 accounts, NetApp, take care of it. And we will, every day on a scheduled basis, we'll back that up to inexpensive object storage with unlimited retention, unlimited capacity. And if you have an employee that blows away a SharePoint directory, maybe it's unintentional. Or if you have somebody that lets ransomware into their OneDrive, or if you have an application run amok and screws up a bunch of files, you can just say, hey, can we go restore from the last point, on a very granular basis. That's something people need to pay attention to, as well as I've put all these users up there. Let's make sure I have backup of their FSLogix containers and the shared files. Key point that we have to look at. And a final one, I know I'm running long, is compliance. When you talk about HIPAA, PII, CCPA, GDPR, that kind of thing. And again, it's the distributed responsibility liability to the centralized responsibility liability model. So when that happens, I think that we need to say, this is the time. It's almost a gargantuan task to say, I'm going to do compliance on 5,000 desktops. I don't want to be that guy that has that job. But I mean, you're talking agents and updates and versions and complex distributed stuff. But if you bring everything together into the cloud, you can say, run compliance on that and look for violations or produce my reports. Or if I'm asked by a client about their data, I want to be able to produce it just like that, and anybody in the organization. And you can do that. That's another one of our the services we have called Cloud Compliance, where you have built-in reports. You just point it to the repository, file shares or databases, et cetera, and it'll scan it. What the smart people actually that I've seen, unless they're in a highly regulated industry, what they do is they scan their backups from, usually it's the last X number of hours. So they're watching and they're doing reporting from the backups. And that way they've offloaded the production systems, really easy to set up. And again, it's built on an X number of cents per month basis. So it's very budgetable and very simple to do, and usually takes 3 minutes to set up.
Yeah, big necessity too. So interesting enough, again, when we were talking the other day, what stuck out when we were having these conversations was VDI at enterprise scale, right? I mean, that term in itself really puts in focus, I think, what I was saying earlier, where when the adoption rate of VDI was sort of slow and it was being produced, in small little proof of concepts, the enterprise, right, was already thinking and moving forward a lot faster than some of the mid tier that we were working with. And so the enterprise scale now is no longer what I would consider enterprise. It's like across the board, right? From top to bottom, considering what happened last year where all the users were going remote. The other interesting challenge that you had mentioned was I like to call the run what you brung kind of mentality, right? So I have a laptop at home. You don't have to provide me a laptop. I'll manage it on my own, and I'm just going to log into my virtual desktop through this laptop. So there's a lot of other concerns of what you're bringing into the organization, how you're connecting, whether that's through iPads or whatever it may be. And then, like you had said, right, the management of the data, where's that going to happen, and the compliance that happens, because you're pushing a lot of this stuff out now to your end users, and still trying to keep the desktop infrastructure internal. And then there's the applications that you need to consider as well, because there's, on top of all that we've talked about, right, and not to belabor the fact of it's a lot to run, is managing the applications that need to run on these virtual desktops. So it really comes back again, right, where the burden, although there's a cost burden, attributed to it, there's still a burden on your teams, right, that need to run it.
Yes.
And so one of the key things, right, is obviously infrastructure. And I know NetApp provides a plethora of in their portfolio that actually helps our clients, bring some of this virtual desktop, sort of to the forefront, and helps drive some of that cost down in how they're doing things. But how do we actually get to managing this? How do we get to or how do our clients, right, or prospects or people who are having conversation like, how do we talk to them in terms of management, right? Who's going to take care of this stuff? And I know that you had mentioned, about third party. There's something that NetApp has done where they're looking at other providers to provide that management mechanism on top of that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think there's three things you've touched on. One's the infrastructure, two is the management of what has now become a much larger infrastructure, and three is complexity and intellectual capital, and do I have the competency and the manpower in-house? So let me touch on the infrastructure, because it's a really important thing we're seeing. When I walk out in the morning and the sun is shining and it's blue sky, which it is here in New Jersey today, it's going to be a good day. When I walk out and it's gloomy and stormy, it's tougher to have a good day. Your users are the same. And there are weather patterns in VDI, because what we have learned is there's things called boot storms and login storms and AV storms. There's a lot of storms in the VDI world. And you know what that means? If your users face a lot of storms, they don't want to live there anymore. Your VDI project can fail due to lack of user acceptance and user resistance. So you got to prevent the storms. And one of the key areas that is all built on is, what's the infrastructure underlying this VDI environment? If you have 200 or 300 contractors, okay, you can determine what the risk is if they're not happy. If you have 5,000 employees, including your CEO, it's a higher risk if they're not happy, right? Let me give you a real world business example. We've got a customer that has around 1,000 to 1,500 users on at any one time. They're a university out on the West Coast. They use Azure and Windows Virtual Desktop as their educational environment. When you go into a class, you sign on, especially the computer science classes, but not restricted to that. What they found is when they were using commodity level infrastructure like they had done before, and you have 1,000 users sign on at the same time, you have boot storms and login storms. Boot storms are very read intensive, login storms are more write intensive, but they both bring performance in these. They had 50-minute classes. In the first 5 to 10 minutes where the system's coming up, because everybody is hammering the same resource all over the campus to get booted up. IOs matter. Well, so what we did was we introduced the concept of Azure NetApp Files, which is a fully managed, high-performance disk offering by NetApp as the underlying infrastructure. It provides sub-millisecond response time. At 500 users, we've done so many benchmarks at 80 meg per second, continued throughput 55 on a steady state, really good level infrastructure to avoid boot storms and login storms and that kind of thing. As a result, these people are now able to get teaching within a minute, not 5 to 10 minutes. It may not sound like a lot, but look, 5 minutes is 10% of the teaching time. It makes a huge difference. So the infrastructure is important. So that's the second point. Managing that, be it 1,000 users or even more so, we have customers that now that have said, hey, we have a globally distributed VDI footprint. 3 years ago, we had a data center, we had 200 or 300 VDI users that were contractors, they came in from everywhere. But now that it's 2, 3, 4, 5,000 employees, I have to have a VDI workspace in Europe. I've got to have one in US East. I've got to have one in US West. I got to have one in APAC, because kind of a general rule is you want your VDI resources to be within about 30 milliseconds of your users, give or take. Some people are 10, some people are 50, but you can pick the number, because you don't want somebody that's using a desktop that's 450 milliseconds away on the other side of the world. Their overall performance is terrible, right? So you want the VDI resources fairly close, regional proximity, maybe 30 milliseconds. But then if you do that, you end up with multiple workspaces to manage, maybe in multiple clouds. Maybe it's a blend of, well, I had this on-prem environment, I'm going to keep that, but I want to spin up Azure here and here and here, and maybe for political or financial or GDPR or other reasons I have to use Google or AWS over here as well. How do you manage an on-prem, cloud, a multi-cloud from a single pane of glass for thousands of users? And that is why we invested millions to bring to market something called NetApp's Virtual Desktop service. It is a SaaS delivered global control plane that uses machine logic and automation to deploy virtual workspaces in minutes, to manage them on an ongoing basis, and to constantly watch and minimize the use of cloud resources that you're paying for, saving most customers about 45 to 50% of their cloud costs. Because VDI is tough, it's hard, it's complex. I love that graphic that you just put up. This was a study done last May, so it's pretty fresh, by ESG, Enterprise Strategy Group, which shows that 93% of VDI and DAS users either have leveraged or will need to leverage third parties like you guys, like Aspire, in order to set up and manage their VDI environments. And that just speaks to the complexity. The more we can do via automation, the better. And what we're finding is that our partners, like Inspire, are using our VDS services to help their customers get up to speed, and to either then manage it for them, or to educate their customers and transition the management, since technology is doing a lot for you. You can blend either way, and good partners like you guys are doing that. You're talking to customers saying, do you want us to manage it, or do you want to manage it? We'll help you anywhere on that continuum. But I don't think anybody can argue the more you let technology do the job, the less you have to have people doing the job. You know, things like you have 5,000 employees sign on. That is hundreds of virtual machines signing up, being spun up.
Yeah.
Who watches those to say, you know, that virtual machine that supports 10 or 20 users, nobody's used it for an hour. Why is it still running, hitting charges? And those pennies and dollars add up. So VDS will do things like watch which resources are being used. If you set the policies, if they haven't been used within X number of minutes or whatever you decide, it'll spin the resources down. It will consolidate larger numbers of users onto a smaller number of resources according to what you have determined to be the optimum ratio. That's the kind of things we're doing.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I know we've been working with NetApp for a while, so we sort of take that approach. We've been doing it for a long enough time that what we've learned we can apply now. Fast forward to 2020, it was a big impact. There was a lot of conversations, a lot of traction that were happening there. And then our teams being able to support the infrastructure, being able to support things that as you had mentioned, moving forward, because we're seeing a lot of people trying to take this on without any knowledge and
Yeah.
coming to us like Aspire, and using our services, using our delivery mechanisms to be able to bring desktops to their organization, and then being able to manage that, as you had mentioned, as a third party. And partnering with NetApp has been great for our teams, or for our processes, and for our clients as well, to be able to build that underlying infrastructure and a lot of things that you bring to us. Again, we're realizing that unfortunately, it was a push in 2020 from what happened. But at the same time, I think there was a lot of realization that a lot of these things, these new emerging technologies that we're talking about and we're trying to push forward, they do come with some clout behind it as we see things progressing. And 2020 just unfortunately pushed people to have to do something that they were, being cautious about and unaware of. But we were there to help them out, as well as NetApp. And I appreciate your time today to talk to us about some of the things that you're doing in that space.
I enjoy it very much. We value you guys as a partner. We do so much through our partners. This happens to be a space that's near and dear to us. A lot of your viewers and customers might not know that the 3 largest VDI implementations in the world run on NetApp. We know this infrastructure. We know what's required. And it's why we've invested millions and millions over the past couple of years, because we've seen this emerging as a key enterprise workload from the infrastructure layer to the management layer of the infrastructure, to the data management, such as data protection, backup and compliance, et cetera, to enabling fully managed services for our customers. And we appreciate the ability to continue to do that with people like you guys. So don't hesitate to bring us in if you need us.
Definitely. And for those of you that joined, we appreciate your time as well. And if you want to have a conversation about virtual desktops moving forward, or any other technology that we can help with, definitely reach out to us, and we're here to help you get to the next level. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Chris, anything else?
No, thank you, Christian. Thank you, Chuck. And like Christian said, if you would like to continue the conversation, we encourage you to email datacenter@aspiretransforms.com, or you can visit our website and learn more about what Aspire does. Thank you two very much. Thank you for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.